Crisis of doubling housing costs and 22 million people forced to food banks, the Prime Minister could have followed our common sense plan to axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget and stop the crime. Instead, he blew over $60 million on an ArriveCAN app that we didn't need, didn't work, sent 10,000 people erroneously into quarantine, losing income. All the while, the thing costed 750 times more than the Prime Minister promised. Won't he stand up today and admit that the app is just like him? It's not worth the cost. It's not worth the corruption.
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition knows very well that the moment there were allegations around cost overruns or inappropriate contracting practices, the Canadian Border Services Agency immediately began an internal audit and made the appropriate referrals to the appropriate authorities. We take the obligation to manage taxpayers' money very seriously. Under no circumstances would we condone what the Auditor General determined to be contracting practices that did not follow the rules, and anybody who didn't will be held to account.
Absolutely. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, he wants to hold someone to account for the ArriveCAN. Why not hold the one person who had the authority to create the ArriveCAN and who had the authority to stop the ArriveCAN, and that's the Prime Minister of Canada. He is the government. This was a government program we warned wasn't needed, wouldn't work, and now we know it went 750 times over budget. 75% of the contractors did no work at all, but they did buy whiskey and other treats for the top Liberal government officials. Again, won't the Prime Minister admit the app is just like him? Not worth the cost, not worth the corruption.
The Honourable Minister for Public Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague from Public Safety said earlier, we would like to thank the Auditor General and welcome her recommendations on the ArriveCAN application. Some of that report recommendations have already been implemented, some will soon be implemented, including the introduction of new measures to ensure that tasks and deliverables are clearly defined in future professional services contracts. We are committed to continuing to ensure that contracts are delivered in a fair, efficient and transparent manner.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
And again, the Prime Minister is hiding under a rock, refusing to stand up and explain himself after he blew $60 million on this ArriveCAN while Canadians cannot afford to eat, heat or house themselves. This scam involved taking money that could have been used for border security, like scanning the 99% of shipping containers that go without any inspection from our ports with stolen cars, not to mention other things that Canadians could have done with that money. Instead, it stuffed the pockets of 75% of the contractors who did no work. Again, will the Prime Minister admit that the ArriveCAN is not worth the cost and not worth the corruption?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised that the Leader of the Opposition would mention investing in border security when his government cut 1,000 officers that did the exact kind of work that he's now pretending he wants to invest in, when they eliminated 50% of the intelligence capacity in the Border Services Agency to work with local, provincial police and the RCMP. So, Mr. Speaker, we have no lessons to take in investing in border security from somebody who gutted the Border Services Agency.
Member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
The Prime Minister's ArriveCAN was supposed to cost taxpayers $80,000, but it was confirmed by the Auditor General that it in fact cost more than $60 million. And after 8 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, we know that he's not worth the cost and he's definitely not worth the corruption. And this process was so corrupt that his favorite company of two guys in a basement, GC Strategies, got to write the contract for themselves to the exclusion of everybody else. And we know they did no IT work. That's been confirmed, but they got paid $20 million for their trouble. So will this Prime Minister just admit that he's lining the pockets of insiders at the expense of Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, just because our colleague repeats a series of allegations that are not borne out by the facts does not make them true. Absolutely. The facts are, Mr. Speaker, the very moment very moment that there were allegations of inappropriate contracting practices, an internal audit was begun by the President of the Border Services Agency, and referrals were made to the appropriate authorities, including the RCMP. Anybody who did not follow the contracting rules, Mr. Speaker, will be held to account. My friend knows that, and he shouldn't ascribe a series of responsibility where it doesn't exist.
The honourable member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Well, Canadians want us and expect us to ascribe responsibility to the individual responsible, and that's this Prime Minister. This app was supposed to cost $80,000. It cost more than $60 million. They've been under RCMP investigation by the Procurement Ombudsman, by the Auditor General, and the results so far are damning for this government, that they've lined the pockets of insiders while Canadians are lined up at food banks. It's absolutely unacceptable that the cost overruns have seen $20 million go to a company that did absolutely no work on the app. Why are they putting their friends ahead while Canadians suffer?
The Honourable Minister for Public Works.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague responsible for public safety just said, this misinformation and disinformation is completely unacceptable. What was known was that the border had to be closed and that billions of dollars worth of international trade were at stake. What we heard from the Auditor General this morning was that the situation was unacceptable, so we need to work hard on making sure that things are done properly in the public service of Canada.
The Prime Minister's ArriveCAN app is not worth the cost or the corruption to Canadians. Today, the Auditor General informed us that ArriveCAN, an app that was supposed to cost $80,000, will now cost Canadians a minimum of $60 million. It gets worse. Due to documentation that the AG says was deleted or destroyed, it could be more than $60 million. Wow. She doesn't know who worked on ArriveCAN, if the work was fulfilled to requirements, or if it was even completed at all. So why did the Prime Minister rig the process so that insiders get rich and taxpayers foot the bill?
The honourable member for Public Security.
Again, Mr. Speaker, repeating the last part of my honourable friend's question does not make it true. Nope. What is true, Mr. Speaker, is that at the moment contracting practice irregularities were identified, the Border Services Agency took all of the steps appropriate to determine exactly what were the facts and to hold those responsible to account in the case that that's necessary. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General identified a series of contracting practices that were not followed. The government does not condone that behavior and has taken all the steps to make sure that those circumstances don't repeat themselves.
The honourable member from Calgary, Midnapore.
Every word I say is true, and that member knows it. The Prime Minister's ArriveCAN app is not worth the cost or corruption. Contractors were paid over $1,000 a day, even though 18% of the invoices for these contracts had no supporting documentation. So we don't even know if the contractors completed the work. GC Strategies pocketed almost $20 million and yet completed no work themselves. It gets worse. They wrote the requirements for the $25 million contract that they won. Simple question for the Prime Minister. How is he going to get our money back?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the Auditor General identified some contracting practices that were clearly not followed. Mr. Speaker, under no circumstance is that an acceptable circumstance. Governments have responsibility to manage taxpayers' funds in the most effective way possible. That's why we have accepted all of the Auditor General's recommendations. And the good news, Mr. Speaker, is the Border Services Agency and the Procurement Department had already begun to act to put in place a number of oversight measures before the Auditor General's report, and we look forward to fully implementing everything that she suggested.
The honourable member for Mégantic-Les-Sables. The Prime Minister's ArriveCAN app is not worth the money. It's not worth the unjustified cost. It's not worth the lack of expense justification. It's not worth the blatant lack of accounting practices. And it's also not worth the 10,000 people who were quarantined without justification. According to the Auditor General, the Prime Minister's ArriveCAN app is not worth the minimum $60 million paid by Canadians. It's not worth the corruption Does the Prime Minister realize that? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In times of crisis, the Government of Canada has two responsibilities. One is to provide for people's safety and security, and the second is to follow their internal processes. And there were tens of thousands of Canadians who died in the pandemic. There was billions of dollars worth of international trade at risk, and the borders had to be closed. And so the Auditor General has made some findings about unacceptable mismanagement by people at CBSA. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Almost all Liberals voted against this investigation by the Auditor General. The app was supposed to cost $80,000. It cost and ended up costing at least $60 million. The Prime Minister's app is not worth the cost, the 750% cost overrun. GC Strategies, a two-person company that did no IT work, got $20 million, and the CBSA was unable to tell the Auditor General who chose to hire and pay GC Strategies. Does the Prime Minister realize that it's not worth the cost or the corruption? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the COVID crisis in 2020, there was $1 billion worth of trade at stake. There were people dying every day in hospitals and long-term care. The government had to act quickly. In spite of that, the lack of information sharing and financial practices by CBSA was unacceptable, as the Auditor General reported this morning. The Honourable Member